September 17, 1944. Somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, France. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with wet earth. Inside the cramped hull of an M4 Sherman tank, 5 American soldiers felt the vibration of the 30-ton machine beneath them as they rolled forward through terrain that gave every advantage to the enemy. The commander stood in the turret hatch, scanning the tree line ahead. His hand rested on the rim of the hatch. 33 tons of American steel moving at 25 miles per hour toward an invisible enemy armed with weapons designed to kill tanks at 2,000 yards. Then, the flash. A streak of light from the hedgerow. The 88mm shell crossed the distance in less than a second. If this story has grabbed your attention, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us what World War II topic you want to hear about next, and subscribe to this channel because we're bringing you the real stories that history forgot to tell. Now let's get into what happened when that shell hit. The German 88mm anti-tank gun was the most feared weapon on the Western Front. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the 8.8-centimeter Flak 1836-37 had been repurposed by German forces when they discovered it could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. The 88 fired a projectile weighing approximately 20 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,690 feet per second. Against the frontal armor of an early model Sherman, which measured only 51 millimeters at a 56-degree angle, the 88mm shell passed through like a knife through paper. The Sherman tank had been designed in 1940 and entered service in 1942. It was never meant to fight German heavy tanks. The M4 medium tank was built for infantry support, for mobility, for mechanical reliability, and for mass production. The United States produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks during World War II, more than any other tank model except the Soviet T-34. American factories churned them out at a rate that astounded even the Americans themselves. But quantity came with compromise. The Sherman's armor ranged from 12.7 millimeters in the thinnest spots to 177.8 millimeters in the thickest, concentrated on the gun mantlet. The sides were especially vulnerable, measuring only 38 millimeters. Against the weapons Germany deployed by 1944, this armor was inadequate. The crew of a Sherman consisted of 5 men: the commander, who directed the vehicle and controlled tactical decisions; the gunner, who aimed and fired the main gun; the loader, who fed shells into the breech; the driver, who controlled the movement of the tank; and the assistant driver, also called the bow gunner, who operated the hull-mounted machine gun and helped navigate. These 5 men worked in a space smaller than most modern bathrooms, surrounded by ammunition, fuel, and hydraulic fluid. When a Sherman was penetrated by enemy fire, the crew had seconds to escape before the vehicle became an inferno. The statistics were brutal. According to U.S. First Army records from June 1944 to April 1945, approximately 48% of Sherman tanks that were knocked out resulted in at least 1 crew member killed. The average number killed per loss was 0.9 crewmen. Of the 4,954 American tank crewmen who became casualties in the European theater, 878 were killed. The driver and bow gunner each accounted for roughly 20% of fatalities because they sat in the front hull, directly in the path of most incoming fire. The loader accounted for 17%. But these numbers told only part of the story. They represented averages across all types of tank losses, including mechanical failures and non-penetrating hits. When an 88mm shell penetrated a Sherman, the mortality rate jumped dramatically. The German gunner who fired that shell on September 17, 1944, had positioned his weapon in a concealed position behind the hedgerow. The 88mm gun was a marvel of German engineering. It could be deployed quickly, camouflaged effectively, and fired with devastating accuracy. German crews trained extensively on these weapons. They knew the weak points of Allied armor. They knew to aim for the sides or the lower glacis plate, where the armor was thinnest. They knew that at combat ranges under 1,000 yards, an 88mm shell would penetrate any point on a Sherman tank. Inside the Sherman, the commander saw the muzzle flash half a second before impact. Not enough time to shout a warning. Not enough time to drop into the turret. Not enough time to think. The human brain processes visual information in approximately 200 to 250 milliseconds under normal conditions. In combat, flooded with adrenaline, reaction time improved, but not enough. The 88mm shell traveled at 820 meters per second. At a range of 500 yards, it reached the Sherman in approximately 0.55 seconds. The shell struck the right front side of the hull just above the track. It penetrated the 38mm side armor without slowing. Inside the tank, the projectile traveled at supersonic speed through the crew compartment. The kinetic energy released upon penetration was equivalent to a small explosion. Metal fragments from the armor plate became shrapnel, flying through the interior at velocities that turned them into deadly projectiles. The shell itself, if it was an armor-piercing round, continued through the tank until it struck something solid enough to stop it or exited through the opposite side. If it was a high-explosive round, it detonated inside the crew compartment. The bow gunner died instantly. He sat directly in the path of the penetrating shell. The impact killed him before his nervous system could register pain. The driver, seated less than 2 feet to the left, was struck by fragments and killed within seconds. The loader, standing in the turret basket, caught shrapnel in his torso and head. He collapsed on the turret floor, dead before his body stopped moving. The gunner, protected partially by the gun breech and the turret structure, survived the initial penetration but was severely wounded. He lived for perhaps 30 seconds before blood loss and trauma ended his life. The commander, standing in the turret hatch with his upper body exposed above the turret roof, was shielded from the worst of the blast by the turret structure. The penetrating shell passed below him, passing through the hull crew compartment. The fragments and overpressure wave that killed his crew were confined largely to the hull interior and lower turret basket. He felt the tank shudder. He heard the metallic impact, a sound like a giant hammer striking an anvil. He heard nothing else. The explosion inside the tank was loud enough to cause immediate hearing damage, but he was far enough from the point of impact that the sound wave didn't rupture his eardrums. What he experienced instead was a sudden silence, the kind that follows a massive auditory overload when the brain temporarily shuts down hearing to protect itself.
The Sherman did not catch fire immediately. This is important. Popular culture and wartime memoirs created a mythology around the Sherman as a death trap that brewed up instantly when hit. The nickname Ronson supposedly came from the Ronson Lighter Company's slogan, "Lights first time, every time." But this was largely a myth. Historical analysis of Sherman losses revealed that the tank caught fire after penetration only about 60 to 65% of the time with early dry stowage ammunition racks. After the introduction of wet stowage ammunition racks in March 1944, where shells were surrounded by water-filled jackets, the fire rate dropped to approximately 10 to 15%. This particular Sherman had wet stowage. The ammunition was stored in the floor of the tank in vertical racks surrounded by 38 gallons of water and antifreeze mixture. When a shell was hit by fragments or fire, the water was released to extinguish the flames. The system worked remarkably well when given time to function, but it couldn't prevent fires caused by ruptured fuel lines or hydraulic fluid ignition. The Sherman ran on gasoline, not diesel. It carried 175 gallons of fuel in armored sponson tanks. A penetrating hit could rupture these tanks or sever fuel lines, creating an immediate fire hazard. The commander's survival came down to position and timing. He was in the one place on the tank where the armor and structure provided protection from a hull penetration. The turret sat on a ball-bearing race that allowed it to rotate independently of the hull. The floor of the turret basket, where the gunner and loader stood, was part of the hull structure, but the sides of the turret and the turret roof were separate. When the 88mm shell penetrated the right front hull, the fragments and blast wave traveled horizontally through the hull crew compartment. compartment. Some fragments angled upward into the turret basket, but the majority of the energy dissipated before reaching the commander's position. He didn't know any of this in the moment. What he knew was that his tank had stopped moving. The engine was still running, but the transmission was no longer engaged. The driver was dead, his hands no longer on the controls. The assistant driver was dead, slumped in his seat. The commander's training took over. He dropped into the turret and looked for his crew. The gunner was collapsed against the side of the turret. The loader was on the floor. Blood covered every surface. The smell hit him, a mixture of burned propellant, hot metal, blood, and evacuated bowels. Every person who dies violently loses control of their bodily functions. In the confined space of a tank turret, that smell became overwhelming. He reached for the radio to call for help. The radio was dead. The intercom system, powered by the tank's electrical system, was non-functional. He was alone in a disabled tank in enemy territory. German forces had demonstrated repeatedly that they would target disabled vehicles with follow-up shots to prevent recovery. A second 88mm shell could arrive at any moment. He needed to evacuate immediately. The escape procedures for a Sherman tank crew were straightforward in theory. The commander, gunner, and loader exited through the turret hatches. There were two, the commander's hatch on the right side of the turret and the loader's hatch on the left. The driver and bow gunner exited through their individual hatches in the front hull or through the belly escape hatch located under the center of the hull between their seats. In an emergency, everyone headed for the nearest exit. The commander pushed open his hatch. It swung upward on its hinges. He pulled himself up and out, his hands gripping the edges of the hatch opening. He expected to see his crew following him. They didn't come. He looked back down into the turret and understood why. They were all dead. 4 men who had been alive 30 seconds ago were now corpses in various states of trauma. The weight of command settled on him in that moment. He was responsible for these men. He had led them into this ambush. He had failed to spot the hidden 88mm gun. He had failed to take evasive action. The fact that no tank commander could have done differently made no difference to the guilt. Later, in the decades that followed, that guilt would wake him in the night, would poison his quiet moments, would make him question every decision he had made that day. But in that moment, survival instinct overrode everything else. He climbed out of the turret and dropped to the ground. The hedgerow that concealed the German gun position was approximately 200 yards to his right front. If the German crew had reloaded, they would fire again. If German infantry were nearby, they would engage him with small arms fire. He ran. The nearest cover was a drainage ditch 30 yards behind the disabled Sherman. He sprinted for it, expecting bullets to strike him down at any second. None came. He dove into the ditch and pressed himself flat against the earth. From that position, he watched his tank. Smoke began to rise from the engine deck. Something inside was burning, probably leaked fuel or hydraulic fluid ignited by hot metal. The fire spread slowly at first, then accelerated as it found more fuel. Within 5 minutes, flames were visible through the driver's vision ports. Within 10 minutes, the entire vehicle was engulfed. The wet stowage ammunition, protected by its water jackets, didn't cook off immediately, but eventually the heat overwhelmed the protection. The first shell exploded with a muffled thump, then another, then a rapid series of detonations as the remaining ammunition cooked off in sequence. The turret lifted slightly from the force of the internal explosions and settled back at an angle. His crew burned with the tank. Their bodies, already dead, were consumed by the fire. There would be no recovery, no identification, no individual graves. They would be listed as killed in action, their remains unrecovered. Their families would receive telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands had died in service to their country. The telegrams would be vague about the circumstances. The families would spend the rest of their lives wondering exactly how their loved ones had died, hoping it had been quick and painless. The truth that 4 men had died in an instant from an 88mm shell penetration would have been cold comfort. The commander remained in the ditch for 30 minutes. Eventually, other American tanks from his platoon arrived. They had heard the explosion and seen the smoke. They found him alive, uninjured physically, but in shock. He told them what happened. They radioed back to battalion headquarters. The report was simple. 1 Sherman lost, 4 KIA, 1 commander survived. The burned-out hulk would be recovered later by maintenance crews and evaluated for salvage. The engine and transmission might be repairable,
the hull was a total loss. The tank would be stripped for parts and the hull discarded. The mythology around the Sherman as a death trap was complex and rooted in partial truths. Yes, Shermans caught fire when penetrated, but so did every other tank of World War II. The German Panther had a reputation for engine fires even without being hit. The Tiger, heavily armored and mounting the feared 88mm gun, was mechanically unreliable and prone to transmission failures that could trap crews inside a disabled vehicle. The Soviet T-34, produced in even larger numbers than the Sherman, had worse crew survivability rates. According to Soviet data, approximately 28% of T-34 crew members died when their tank was knocked out, compared to 24.6% for Sherman crews. The Sherman's advantages were in areas that didn't make for dramatic stories. It was mechanically reliable. American crews could count on their tanks to start every morning, to run for days without breakdown, to be repairable in the field with standard tools. The Sherman was ergonomically designed for crew comfort, a consideration that German tank designers largely ignored. It had better vision devices than most German tanks. It had a powered turret traverse, allowing the gunner to track moving targets smoothly. It had a gyroscopic stabilizer for the main gun, a feature that allowed firing while moving, something no German tank could do effectively. But none of these advantages mattered to a crew facing an 88mm gun. When German gunners positioned their weapons in ambush and fired at ranges under 1,000 yards, Sherman crews died. The tactical doctrine that emerged from this reality was simple. Don't fight German tanks directly. Use superior numbers, superior mobility, and combined arms tactics. Call in artillery. Call in air support, flank the enemy position, bypass strong points, and let infantry deal with them. Use the Sherman for what it was designed for, supporting infantry, destroying soft targets, and exploiting breakthroughs. The commander who survived understood all of this. He understood that his crew had died not because the Sherman was a bad tank, but because tanks in general were vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons. A Tiger or Panther in the same position would have fared better against the 88mm, but not much better. The 88 could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges if it hit the right spot. No tank was invincible. What separated survival from death was often random chance. The angle of impact, the exact point where the shell struck, whether the shell penetrated or ricocheted, whether the ammunition cooked off or the crew escaped before fire consumed the vehicle. The commander had survived because he was standing in the turret hatch when the shell struck the hull. If he had been buttoned up inside the turret, he might have died with his crew. If the German gunner had aimed 6 inches higher or 2 feet to the left, the shell might have struck the turret instead of the hull. Small variations in factors no one could control determined who lived and who died. The symbolic object in this story isn't a weapon or equipment. It's the commander's hatch, the circular opening in the turret roof that represented the boundary between the protected interior of the tank and the exposed exterior. When a tank commander stood in the hatch with his head and shoulders exposed, he accepted increased vulnerability in exchange for better visibility and situational awareness. This was the eternal trade-off of tank warfare. Buttoned up, the crew was protected but blind, dependent on limited vision devices to see the battlefield. Unbuttoned, they could see and hear everything, but were vulnerable to shell fragments, small arms fire, and artillery. The commander's hatch represented this choice between safety and effectiveness, between survival and mission accomplishment. American tank doctrine emphasized fighting unbuttoned whenever possible. Commanders were expected to stand in the hatch to direct their vehicles. This exposed them to danger, but made them more effective leaders. German doctrine was similar. Veteran tank commanders on both sides understood that staying buttoned up too long would get you killed just as surely as exposing yourself unnecessarily. The key was judgment, knowing when to button up and when to risk exposure. The commander in this story had made the right choice. His position in the hatch saved his life. The psychological impact of being the sole survivor was profound. Survivor's guilt is a well-documented phenomenon among combat veterans. The question, why did I survive when they died, has no good answer. Random chance feels like an insult to the memory of the dead. The survivor feels that he should have done something, anything, to save his crew. The rational part of his mind knows that nothing could have been done. The shell struck before anyone could react. The crew died instantly or within seconds. There was no opportunity for heroic action. No moment moment where a different decision would have changed the outcome. But the emotional part of his mind rejected that logic. It insisted that he was responsible, that he should have been a better commander, that he should have spotted the 88mm position before it fired, that he should have taken a different route or moved faster or called for artillery support earlier. This guilt shaped the rest of his life. He survived the war, he went home, he tried to readjust to civilian life, but a part of him remained in that burning Sherman in Normandy, watching his crew die. He attended memorial services for tank crews. He sought out families of his dead crewmen and tried to explain what happened. He told them their sons or husbands had died instantly, that they hadn't suffered. This was partly true. The bow gunner and driver had died instantly, the loader and gunner had died within seconds, but instantly and without suffering were concepts that provided comfort to families, not medical accuracy. The commander knew this, but told the comforting lie because it was what the families needed to hear.
The transformation that this experience produced was subtle but permanent. Before the war, the commander had believed in the American narrative of technological superiority and inevitable victory. He had trusted that American industry, American ingenuity, and American determination would overwhelm any enemy. He had faith in the equipment he was given and confidence in the training he received. The 88mm shell shattered those beliefs. He learned that technology had limits, that industrial production couldn't substitute for tactical superiority, that good men died regardless of confidence or faith. This didn't make him bitter. It made him realistic. After the war, he spoke to training units about the realities of tank combat. He emphasized the importance of combined arms tactics. He stressed that tanks were vulnerable and needed infantry support, artillery support, and air support to survive. He argued against the romanticization of tank warfare. There was nothing glorious about being trapped in a burning steel box, watching your friends die from wounds you couldn't treat, waiting for rescue that might not come. War was not an adventure. It was a brutal, mechanical process that killed indiscriminately. The epilogue of this story is not about the commander alone. It's about the men who died with him, the families who mourned them, and the thousands of other Sherman crews who faced the same dangers. American tank casualties in the European theater from D-Day to VE Day totaled approximately 1,800 killed out of roughly 15,000 tank crewmen who saw combat. This represents a casualty rate of about 12%, far lower than infantry casualties, but still significant. Each death left behind parents, siblings, wives, and children who bore the emotional weight of loss for the rest of their lives. The 4 men who died in that Sherman on September 17th, 1944, were average American soldiers. They came from different backgrounds. Some were draftees, others volunteers. They had trained together at Fort Knox or Fort Benning, learning to operate the M4 Sherman as a coordinated team. They had shipped overseas together, landed in Normandy weeks or months after D-Day, and fought through the hedgerows alongside hundreds of other tank crews. Their names appeared on casualty lists, in official reports, and eventually on memorial walls. But their individual stories, their personalities, their hopes and dreams faded from collective memory. The commander remembered them. He carried their photographs in his wallet for decades. He remembered their voices, their jokes, their habits. He remembered the driver's skill at maneuvering through tight spaces, the bow gunner's accuracy with the hull machine gun, the loader's speed at feeding shells into the breech, the gunner's calm under fire. These men had been his responsibility, and he had led them into a situation where they died, and he lived. No amount of rational explanation could fully absolve that guilt. The larger truth this story illuminates is that technological advantage is meaningless without tactical superiority. The Sherman tank represented American industrial might. The United States produced 49,234 Shermans between 1942 and 1945, along with thousands of other armored vehicles. This production capacity was unmatched by any other nation. Germany produced approximately 25,000 medium and heavy tanks during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced over 80,000 tanks, but many were lighter models. American factories turned out Shermans at a rate that allowed battlefield losses to be replaced within weeks. But this abundance had a cost. Because Shermans were plentiful,
Commanders used them aggressively. Losses were acceptable because replacement tanks arrived quickly. Crews knew this. They knew that their tank was expendable, that if it was destroyed, another would take its place, and that the war would continue regardless of their survival. This created a psychological burden different from what German or Soviet crews experienced. German tank crews fought in vehicles that were irreplaceable, knowing that each loss weakened their force permanently. Soviet crews fought in a system that viewed both tanks and men as expendable resources. American crews fought in the middle ground, knowing their tanks would be replaced, but uncertain whether they would survive to crew the replacement. The Sherman tank commander who survived the 88mm hit embodied this reality. He was one man among thousands who faced the same dangers, made the same choices, and trusted their lives to 30 tons of welded steel and rivets. Most survived the war, some died. The difference was often nothing more than the angle of an incoming shell or the timing of a tactical decision made by someone far from the battlefield. This randomness is perhaps the most difficult aspect of war to accept. It offends our human need for meaning and control. We want to believe that survival is earned through skill, bravery, and good decision-making. Sometimes it is. Often it's just luck. The crew who died in that Sherman on September 17, 1944, didn't fail. They didn't make mistakes. They were killed by a weapon that could penetrate their armor before they knew it was there. The commander who survived didn't succeed through superior skill. He survived because he was standing in the right position when the shell struck. This is not a satisfying narrative. It doesn't provide the moral clarity that we prefer in our stories, but it's true and it's important. War doesn't care about narrative structure or moral clarity. It produces survivors and casualties without regard to justice or fairness. Freedom and democracy, the abstract ideals for which these men fought, were purchased with random death and arbitrary survival. The men in that Sherman tank on September 17, 1944, weren't thinking about abstract ideals when the 88mm shell struck. They were thinking about their immediate tasks: driving, loading, gunning, commanding. They were thinking about surviving the next hour, the next day, the next week. They were thinking about going home. Most of them never did. The commander went home. He lived with the weight of their deaths for the rest of his life. He tried to honor their memory by living well, by telling their stories, by ensuring that their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. But memory is fragile. Generations pass. The veterans die. The families die. Eventually, all that remains are records and archives, names on memorial walls, and stories like this one. The Sherman tank, symbol of American abundance, was both a capable machine and a vulnerable coffin. It represented the contradiction at the heart of American military power: overwhelming industrial capacity combined with tactical vulnerability. The United States could produce tanks faster than the enemy could destroy them, but that didn't protect individual crews from sudden, violent death. The commander who survived understood this contradiction. He lived it, and in living with it, he bore witness to a truth about war that civilian society often refuses to acknowledge. Victory is built on the corpses of young men who didn't deserve to die, but died anyway.